This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Were the so-called silent centuries between Malachi and Matthew really all that silent? Welcome to Iron and Myth, our monthly roundtable discussion here on A View from the Bunker. Last month we talked about the book of 1 Enoch. This month we discuss another book written at about the same time that discusses much of the same material, but from a different perspective. Joining me to discuss, the author of Giant Sons of the Gods, Rings of Revelation, the Angel of the Lord, Doug Van Dorn, best-selling author and award-winning screenwriter, the author of the novels Judah, Maccabee Parts 1 and 2, Abomination of Desolation, and Against the Gods of Greece, and the theological thriller, Cruel Logic, Brian Godawa, and the director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, author of Interview with the Giant, Dr. Judd Burton. Gentlemen, welcome. We've had quite a struggle getting this one technically off the ground, and I see that Judd has already dropped out once again. This ought to make things very interesting in the editing side. Because last month I had to piece together Judd's 7 different connections to the program. So hopefully he'll be with us long enough to make a good contribution, because there's a lot of stuff in here that we want his opinion on, and that is about the Book of Jubilees. Guys, I've heard about the Book of Jubilees for a long time, but until we decided to take a look at this, I had never read through it. It's the thing that struck me, and we'll just kind of go around the room here. The thing that struck me is that even though this was written at roughly the same time as much of the book of 1 Enoch, 2nd century BC, it's got a very different take on the events, especially the parts of Genesis where it overlaps with 1 Enoch. So some very interesting things that we'll get into here, but it really struck me that this was more of a focus on the law, which was not necessarily the focus of Enoch. Enoch seemed more focused on why the world was in such a mess and what God was going to do to fix it.
My big 30,000
Brian,
feet
what was your takeaway
reaction
from
was
the Book of Jubilees?
What struck me was this writer. So to let everyone know what it is, Jubilees is a retelling of Genesis and part of Exodus, and there's a lot of it claims to be actual revelation from God. The first chapter talks about, these heavenly tablets were also given at Sinai, and then this is what was also said. So it's got that very unusual claim of like, this is scripture. And in that sense, it tries to read like scripture, and it compared to other pseudepigraphic books, it tries to stay close to that, relatively speaking, right? But of course, there's a lot of differences. And the thing that stuck out to me most, there's a lot of things, but one was, and I know people are going to want us to talk about the Watchers part of it, but what struck me is how it had this vibe of the writing. Well, first of all, it doesn't read like scripture. This is the kind of coolest thing about all these pseudepigraphic books and apocrypha. You read them and they just don't have the quality of storytelling, of theology or whatever. You can just, if you're versed in scripture, you can really see that. And of course, we still appreciate them as a way of understanding how the Jews did interpret scripture in the ancient days, and that's helpful. But it was almost like it was a hagiographic attempt to sort of retell the scriptures and fix a few things that they thought either might be misunderstood or people would get wrong if they didn't know. It's sort of like, it's not like they're trying to correct scripture, but trying to fill it in to explain all the problems that they think people see. Biggest thing to me being, you mentioned the law, and it's this retrojection of the law into the world of the patriarchs. And it's not the whole law, but it's specific festivals and some specific laws, of right. Leviticus, etc., as they might apply to the patriarchs, whether it's Abraham or Jacob or whatever. And it's this sort of narrative where Noah and Abraham, they're literally following laws and sacrificial laws from Leviticus before that was revealed. And I think that the goal there was, the attempt to, the sense that I got of it was, it's an attempt to, and scholars support this too, it's an attempt to, it's an attempt to root the law that they know came at the time of Moses, and it's an attempt to retroject that so that people will see it as being more eternal. In other words, it didn't just start with Moses; it was there from all the way from creation. The law that we have, and that's an attempt to justify it, right? In other words, our religion. Again, if this was written during the Maccabees, we know the Maccabean times were very much time of Hellenism, where the Greco world was affecting everything, including Judaism, and the Maccabean time was a heavy period of syncretism, where Greece, the Grecian worldview had really synchronized a lot with Jews, such that the great split occurred, where the Maccabees rose up and say, enough, we're not going to compromise our faith anymore. We're not going to compromise our religion. We're not going to follow these Greek ways, right? And so that's a strong emphasis of that time period. So it makes sense that they would like to say, well, our religion wasn't just recently revealed. It's always been there. And that's why we have this, permanent sort of religion, And I mean, we're not above that as Christians either. We look back in the scriptures and find Christ back there, right? But nonetheless, that's the vibe that I got. Oh, they're trying to sort of protect the scriptures by justifying their particular, their Jewish law, their Mosaic law in the ancient world that before the law existed.
I noticed that, for example, they credit Abraham with being the first to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, which, of course, Abraham was 4 centuries before the law was given to Moses. So it's as though the author of Jubilees would have disagreed with the late Chuck Missler when he said, Abraham didn't eat kosher. Which, takes some people aback until they stop and realize, wait a minute, law hadn't been given yet. But that appears to be the point that the author of Jubilees is making. It's like, we have always had the law going back to Noah, and it was his sons who stopped following what they were supposed to do, and then we had to bring it back through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and until it was given to Moses. But the interesting thing, the style of Jubilees is that it's actually being dictated to Moses, and Moses is being told, okay, write down all of this stuff that I am telling you that's already written in the heavenly tablets. And this is, as you say, I think, and this is interesting given that you just researched and wrote the 2 novels about Judah Maccabee and the Maccabean Rebellion, that this may well have been a response to the Hellenization of the Jews in Judea after the conquest of the region by Alexander the Great.
Yeah, and I also wanted to throw this out there. I forgot to mention this. By the way, this is the book where I got names for my characters in my Enoch primordial novel, because one of the unique aspects is it gives a lot of the names of wives of patriarchs that aren't in the Bible. And so Methuselah's wife, Enoch's wife, Lamech's wife, and Noah's wife, I got all the names from the Book of Jubilees, which is why, I like to draw from the Jewish traditions to fill out, the gaps with fictional things that aren't just made up, but by myself, but are drawn at least from the ancient Jewish tradition.
The other thing I thought curious was that this, like First Enoch, said that the actual annual calendar should be based on a 364-day year, or 365-day year. I mean, which is interesting because that's the age Enoch was when he was called up, transported up to heaven, rather than on a lunar calendar, which appears to have been, that's the way the law was given to Moses. But First Enoch and Book of Jubilees says, nope, year consists of 364 days, so shifting to a solar calendar away from the lunar calendar and going so far as to say in Jubilees that people were following, the Jews were following the lunar calendar, which then was moving the feast days and the festival days to days that were not sanctified, to days that were not holy. And I thought that was really curious.
Yeah, there's a lot of pseudepigrapha that deals with that. I think there's a book called The Testament of Shem. It's a whole lunar, solar, calendrical thing that you can read in the pseudepigrapha. It makes me wonder if this isn't coming out of Babylonian exile and, how obsessed they were with the stars and all that kind of stuff, that somehow this is, I don't know if you would call it a syncretism, but certainly an awareness of the heavenly bodies that they probably didn't have prior to going to Babylon.
Well, you bring that up, but if it's in the Hellenistic period, it actually might make more sense, because even though I'm actually researching Babylon right now for my next novel series, and while the Babylonians were definitely rooted in astrological phenomenon, the whole thing of this horoscopes, that's all in the Hellenistic period. That wasn't in the Babylonian period. And the notion of the stars controlling our fates was also not really a part of the Babylonian worldview. It was that they influenced us, but that it wasn't fate oriented, right? And so in a way, I could see this being in the Hellenistic period, where that astrological and astrology of the Hellenists, they took Babylonian astrology and pushed it further, I guess.
You need to remember, it just kind of strikes me that in the synagogues in the early centuries AD, you have these zodiacs that are in the synagogues, but they're not of the constellations or of the 12 tribes. And so Israel is seeing itself as the center of the universe, and the whole universe is revolving around it. And so it makes a lot of sense that they would be obsessed with the calendar the way that they are.
Well, it looks like Judd is looks like he's making an appearance again here. It's not just so the audience knows, we are trying to troubleshoot on the fly here as we're recording. So it was strange, because this platform that we use to record is normally very reliable, and Judd uses this platform to do other podcasts. It's only this one, for some reason, that it keeps trying to kick him off. Maybe it's because there are too many of us crowding for room. He just got kicked off again. So we're gonna have to try to figure out what exactly is going on here.
Ask him a question.
Quick, cowbell him.
And another thing that's our young fan. Of course, and I'm forgetting his name now. Oliver, who we wished a Merry Christmas to about a year or so ago, is now a huge fan of Judd. So he's been very disappointed that Judd has not been able to get his picture up there. Judd, I talked to his father the other day, and apparently Oliver wants to talk to you about 3 or 4 times a day. He's pleading with his dad to let him call you. So Tommy is trying to spare Judd the very enthusiastic 7-year-old boy who wants to talk to Judd. Coming back to Jubilees, the other thing I thought was interesting was the description of the angel. And Doug, I think you might have a comment on this, having written a book called Angel of the Lord. The angel of the presence being the one who was dictating to Moses the text of the Book of Jubilees, and the angel of the presence playing a role through there. In fact, there are places in Jubilees where he says, "And I stood between the Egyptians and the Israelites, so as you know, to get you across the Red Sea. And I was there with Abraham and brought him the message that Sarah would have a son, and then went to Lot to, So apparently this idea, the angel of the presence, was a very powerful angel in the mind of the writer of Jubilees.
Yeah, you have all kinds of different speculation about the angel in different pseudepigrapha. I think one of the interesting things with this book is that it also has this character Mastema, which are kind of become enemies, right? And Mastema is very much a Satan figure. In fact, you could make a good argument that he is Satan. So yeah, absolutely. The angel of the presence, the angel of the face, is a language that's taken right out of Exodus 23.
Yeah. Mastema, that's an interesting thing. Actually, the word Satan does show up in there separately, which I found interesting. But so what's interesting is that this is part of the justification sort of context of it, where it looks like they're trying to protect God from being the author of evil, or from being, the cause of evil, because at several points in the Bible where it, talks about God being the one, such as the angel of the Lord being the one who is the destroyer of the firstborn of Egypt, right? Jubilees makes it Mastema, who's this evil guy, right? And that's not the only place, too. It's like also before the flood, there's it brings in Mastema exerting his power over all these actions, sort of like showing the evil was sort of because of Mastema. And then when Moses was on his way back to Egypt in Jubilees 48, it talks about how it was Prince Mastema who was trying to kill him, not the angel of the Lord, right? But you can see how these are actions that maybe some Jews would think, God wouldn't do that, would he? But so they're trying to protect the Bible in that sense. But there was also one last little correspondence factor there. There's some contradictions in Jubilees, and this is one of them. So it talks about Mastema as the instrument of killing the firstborn in Jubilees 49:2. All the forces of Mastema were sent to kill every firstborn. But then 2 verses later, it says, the Lord's forces did everything that the Lord ordered them. They passed over all the Israelites. Now, from my perspective, that's perfectly fine, because that is how the Bible talks, right? In other words, God does control all the acts, and it says Satan instigated David in one book. In another book, it says God instigated David, because God can control Satan and make him do what he wants, right? So I don't personally have a problem with that. But in the context of how Jubilees trying to protect the Bible, it's sort of interesting that, do they have that viewpoint? I don't know, but that was an interesting sort of, you might call it a contradiction, or maybe it isn't a belief that God's sovereignty over evil. But I don't get that vibe from the rest of the book, though.
I don't think we've really done an overview of what Jubilees is. Maybe we should do that. Why should anybody read this book? Why should they care about Jubilees? What is Jubilees? And when I tell people about Jubilees, I call it the little Genesis. It's something like 70 to 80% of the stories of Genesis are in Jubilees. Now, it's not that it's just ripping it off word for word. It's adding a whole bunch of color to it that you don't find in Genesis, but it's retelling the story of Genesis, going all the way up through Moses, in order to somehow justify what we were talking about earlier, that God has given his eternal word to Israel since the very beginning of creation. And it all starts off with this first chapter, right? That there's going to be this coming judgment upon Israel. And this book is kind of laying the groundwork for why that is the case.
Yeah, I think Brian just said it well. He's trying to protect the Bible. It's like the author of Jubilees was trying to prevent the readers of the Tanakh and the Torah from misconstruing, the Torah, because it's just Genesis and about the half of Exodus that is what's in Jubilees, prevent people from misconstruing what's in there. And, why would God tell Abraham, for example, to take Isaac up Mount Moriah and, put him on a stack of wood and tell him to sacrifice his son? Would God actually do that? And that's another event that Mastema is supposed to have provoked God. It's almost like the testing of Job. Mastema goes to God, say, hey, you think Abraham is all that? Well, have him sacrifice his son. See, and it seems to be, an effort to try to protect the Bible, which, as the late Mike Heiser used to say, it's not the job of theologians to protect people to read it from the words in the Bible. It is our responsibility to read it and try to understand them correctly. That seems to be it. Well, that and again, just the reiterating that there was a covenant that God had established with the people of Israel that goes back to before Abraham being called. Hence the idea that, these have been written in the heavenly tablets since the beginning of time. And Moses, here I am, the angel of the presence. I'm just going to read this to you, and you write all this stuff down, and then take it down the mountain to the people of Israel. It's
I first started reading this book back. It's been almost 20 years ago, actually, when I was writing my baptism book, the first book I was doing. And I actually read through the whole pseudepigrapha just looking for baptism motifs, just to see what the Jews thought about it. And you can see in this book that there's priestly stuff happening that they're calling out attention to that I just found so interesting back in the day, talking about things like this covenant with Levi and how God gave Levi this covenant that when you look in the Genesis, you can see hints that maybe there's something there. And, you get a book called Leviticus, which comes from his name and that kind of stuff. And the Levites become the guys who are the priests. That's the priestly tribe. But the pseudepigrapha, we were talking earlier about, should we maybe do the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs at some point in time? Doing the same sort of stuff in the Testament of Levi. I just find that so interesting that there's all this covenantal, baptismal thinking that's taking place with the Jews that I never heard any theologian talk about in my training at school, that I think very much informs the practice of baptism today. And those are the kinds of things that are very different than what you would find in a book like Enoch. It's much more priestly driven than Enoch would ever hope to be. But, that's some of the things that I think are worth reading in the Book of Jubilees that most people wouldn't really think about to talk about.
That's one of the things about First Enoch that I found so interesting, as I've been reading the background of that, researching my next book, that the Essenes, who were the probable authors of members of the Essene community, probably in the north, first around Dan and then later around the Sea of Galilee, were opposed to the priesthood, because the priests said, okay, we just need to live out the law now and be faithful in the performance of our priestly duties, and eventually unrighteousness will be eliminated from Israel, and through that, everything will work out fine. Whereas the Enochians, the Essenes, believed that the Genesis 6 event had so corrupted the earth, the intrusion of the fallen watchers, which is mentioned in Jubilees, but that had so corrupted the earth that there was nothing man could do to fix it, that it was going to take divine intervention, which is, like we discussed last month, that second section, chapters 37 to 71, the Book of Parables, which prophesied the coming anointed one, the chosen one, the Son of Man. You don't see that in the Book of Jubilees. It's just, okay, here's, a retelling of Genesis and the first part of Exodus. But when you get to the end of the Book of Jubilees, it's like, Moses, you write all this stuff down, bring it to the people of Israel, and as long as they keep following this law, then everything is going to turn out fine.
Something else that stood out to me was we talk a lot about sacred geography, on the show. And while First Enoch is much more focused on that, Jubilee has a couple verses that I just were really cool for us because we've talked a lot about this stuff. And it's in Jubilees 4:26. It says, it's talking about Enoch, right? And because of him, the flood water did not come on any of the land. So Enoch is taken up and brought to Eden, it says. And so he can do all his work there when he was translated. And then because of that, the flood didn't touch Eden I don't know, go figure. But anyway, verse 26, and it says, "For there are 4 places on earth that belong to the Lord, the Garden of Eden, the mountain of the east, this mountain on which you are today, Mount Sinai, and Mount Zion, which will be sanctified in the new creation for the sanctification of the earth." And most scholars say that the mountain of the east is Hermon. And so we've got those, and there's another reference to Hermon also earlier in the text. And it's like, and think about it, it would be the mountain in the east compared to, I guess it would be compared to, no, that wouldn't be, would it? But I don't know how they figure that, but some scholars have said that. And, but again, that references those holy mountains that are all connected to Canaan in some way, to Israel in some way. But the other element of that is Canaan is also, so in Jubilees 8, there's a strong, there's a detailed description of all of Noah's sons and their allotments of territories, which the Bible doesn't go into. And I think one of the reasons is they wanted to describe Shem's allotment is described as being Canaan. So in other words, God gave that to Shem, and the context is so that therefore the Canaanites who came into the land, they were already stealing it when they got there.
Yeah.
It wasn't that God came back, God just came and took the land from Canaan, but that God had already given it to Shem, so the Canaanites were illegally there, which justifies them going in. Now, there are justifications for killing the Canaanites, but that's not a biblical one for sure. But it's described as the center of the earth, and Mount Zion is the center of the earth, the navel of the earth. And so, and the other thing was that Enoch is a mountain, or I'm sorry, Eden is a mountain, like we've talked about here before in Ezekiel 28.
Right.
I'm like, ooh, that verse, I wrote that down on my, I went to my Bible where I keep my notes, and I put that in the Ezekiel 28 chapter where it's like, Eden is a mountain. Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that verse 19, he knew that the Garden of Eden was the holy of holies and the dwelling of the Lord. And Mount Sinai was in the midst of the desert, and Mount Zion was in the midst of the navel of the earth, the axis mundi of all the universe. There's
some evidence that Shechem was considered, and this is a rabbit trail, but I'm not going to go down it, just biblical evidence that Shechem was considered to be an axis mundi as well. Diviner coming down from the center of the earth in the story of the rebellion against his sons by his son Abimelech. But it's an interesting concept, but Zion makes more sense, especially from a Jewish perspective. I think there are. I found interesting in the earlier chapters. There's a number of other types of angels that are mentioned there besides the angel of the presence. A number of different, and of course, I scrolled down when you started talking, Brian. So here we go. Up, found it, chapter 2. Angels of sanctification, the angels of the spirit of fire, and the angels of the spirit of the winds, and the angels of the spirit of the clouds, and of darkness, and of snow, and of hail, and of hoarfrost, and the angels of the voice, and of the thunder, and of the lightning, and the angels of the spirits of cold and of heat, and of winter, and of spring, and of autumn and summer, and of all the spirits of his creatures, which are in the heavens and on the earth. One of the consequences of the split between Christians and Jews, especially after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the early 2nd century, was that amongst Jewish religious scholars, the idea of the existence of other spirits in the unseen realm was really de-emphasized to the point where the supernatural interpretation of Genesis 6 was now forbidden by the rabbis. But above all, this idea that there was a second power in heaven, the angel of the Lord, Yahweh, but not Yahweh, that was right out because Christians kept saying, no, we know who that is. That was Jesus of Nazareth. And after the Bar Kokhba revolt, when Christians wouldn't fight for Bar Kokhba because Rabbi Akiva said, he's the Messiah, and Christians like, no, he's not in the clouds, so that ain't him. But here, just 150 years, 200 years earlier, you got it's clear in the Book of Jubilees that they did believe that the unseen realm was full of all different kinds of unseen beings, spirit beings.
Yeah, they're animating nature, right? So that like everything that we think of as natural, that we completely materialize, they've got a supernatural thing undergirding it. And I just find that so infinitely fascinating. I think I pointed this out before, Brian, in the cosmic three-tiered universe thing, where we depict that, the heaven, the earth, and below the earth, and we draw it all out. We have mountains, and we have water, and we have pillars, and it's all very nice and scientific the way that we do it.
Yeah, precise.
I came across an Egyptian version of that that's all gods and stars, but it's the exact same depiction. And I think that's what you're seeing here as well, that this ancient Jewish worldview of between the testaments is infused with the supernatural.
It's not all that different from the worldview of the Canaanites around them. The main difference is that they had a polytheistic worldview where the gods would contend with one. It's sort of like the Greeks. Zeus was the king of the gods, but you had the other gods occasionally scheming against him and trying to put one over on Zeus. And that just didn't happen in the Jewish cosmology. Yahweh was existent, and he was, omnipotent. You were not going to put one over on Yahweh. But they did have scriptures where this is evident. For example, in the Psalm where Moses is the psalmist rather is retelling the Exodus and how God destroyed the cattle of the Egyptians with hail. That's Barad, which was a Canaanite demon or minor deity. And then thunderbolts, which was Reshephim, and Resheph was a very well-known deity in the Canaanite pantheon. Resheph was the plague god. He was the equivalent of Apollo to the Greeks and Romans. But he's pluralized in, I think it's Psalm 78, the Reshephim, translated thunderbolts, as though it's almost a class of angelic being. And then after describing that, they are called a company of destroying angels. So you've got things like plague and pestilence, hail, thunder, things like this that are described using the names of Canaanite, minor Canaanite entities, demonic entities. It's just been translated out of our English Bibles because the translators have a bias against seeing these entities in the unseen realm. And it appears that in Jubilees that was still part of the Jewish religious worldview.
I so wish that Judd was here. Should we move and talk about the Nephilim for a minute?
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, and by the way, Judd has tried for people who are watching or listening, and he's finally got to give up again this month, and we're going to try to troubleshoot this so that the next time around this doesn't happen, because I don't know why he can't get in on this program and he's able to use this same platform to talk to other podcasts. I don't understand the technical issue here. I'm going to have to get with the people who run this platform and figure out what's going on here. Anyway, yes. Yeah. The Watchers are definitely part of the
question that I would love to ask him. I would love to ask him a question about chapter 8. So first of all, I think we should say that Jubilees has the Watcher worldview, the angel and human Nephilim worldview, as does, by the way, every single known Jewish writing of the period. 100%. Yeah. Very important to say that. There was no other view. And it talks about it quite a bit. And it talks about it just like everybody knows. Of course, this is what happened.
Yeah.
And two things I want to highlight just to get you guys to talk about it, see what you think. In Canaan's, this is back in chapter 8 that Brian brought up earlier, Canaan's discovery of astrological lore. It talks about how it says, his father taught him writing, and he went forth in order that he might seek a place where he could build a city. This is after the flood, right? And he found writing in which the ancestors engraved on stone. And he read what was in it and transcribed it. And he sinned because of what was in it, since there was in it the teaching of the watchers, by which they used to observe omens of the sun and the moon and stars with all the signs of heaven. And he copied it down, but he did not tell it about it because he feared to tell Noah about it, lest he be angry with him because of it. And I read that and I go, I mean, it's totally off base. I know it is, but I just go, that's Gobekli Tepe, man. Maybe he's the one that buried it on purpose.
Interesting thought. But again, it gets back to the whole idea of Jubilees being about keeping the cycle, these 49-year cycle of Jubilees. In fact, the name that Jubilees gives itself, repeated a few times, the divisions of the times of the law and of the testimony, of the events of the years, of the weeks of their Jubilees, the divisions of time in which are in the law, which are in the testimony and in the weeks of their Jubilees. And again, the division of the years from the time the law and the testimonies were created for the weeks of their Jubilees. It's a repeated theme. And so this idea of going to the watchers for their interpretation of the movement of the sun, moon, and the stars would be considered just right out.
Yeah, another difference in that storyline, though, that is pretty significant is that whereas in Enoch, the watchers are depicted negatively from the start, in Jubilees, it actually says that it says he named him Jared. This is in Jubilees chapter 6, I think. No, chapter 4. He named him Jared because during his lifetime, the angels of the Lord, who were called watchers, descended to earth to teach humanity and to do what is just and upright upon the earth, which is really different from all the rest of the other stories of the watchers, right? But yet at the same time, so therefore, obviously, they've done something negative after that. But at the same time, that could match an interpretation of, Psalm 82, where it sounds like, yeah, God gives these watchers, he tells them you're supposed to teach humanity, or you're supposed to, rule over humankind, but they become evil and they get judged, right? I guess it could fit into that paradigm in a way, if you see it that way. You know what I mean? My problem with that is just that historically there's no, there's only idolatry from the start of any religion in any country, in any nation, all over the face of earth. It's always, we only find them in context of idolatry, which means there's no real evidence that there was a time period where they weren't, evil or,
I mean, to be fair, that's all post-flood, and this would be a pre-flood world. So theoretically, I suppose it's possible. The golden age.
That's true, because the watchers that we normally talk about is Babylon, in Babel, right? And that could be a completely different scenario,
right? Right.
But there's some.
And I just want to read a couple of passages. I just want to read a couple of passages just so people get the sense of, how it's so similar to what we've always talked about. In chapter 5, it says, when humanity began to multiply on the surface of the entire earth and daughters were born to them, the angels of the Lord in a certain year of this Jubilee, everything operates according to Jubilee years, saw that they were beautiful to look at, so they married of them whoever they chose. They gave birth to children for them, and they were giants, and wickedness increased on the earth. So it's the same language as Genesis and the same language that we read in Enoch as well. And it goes on, but I just wanted to give a little example.
But the point you made it continues in verse 6 here, where it says, and against the angels whom he had sent upon the earth, he was exceedingly wroth, talking about God. Now I'm using the older translation from R.H. Charles. And he gave commandment to root them out of all their dominion, and he bade us, again, this is the angel of the presence talking to Moses, bade us to bind them in the depths of the earth, and behold, they are bound in the midst of them and are kept separate. So there are early church fathers who echo this. So they must have been familiar with the Book of Jubilees, because it's not in First Enoch that the watchers who came down were sent. But there are church fathers who will argue that, yes, they were sent to protect humanity after Eden, to protect the children of Adam and Eve from the temptations of Satan. And they themselves were lured into sinning against humanity by defiling themselves with women, because Satan tempted them to do that. But apparently this is where, or maybe where, the early church fathers got the idea that those watchers who sinned didn't come down here of their own accord, that God sent them, and then they decided to, hey, let's take this planet for ourselves, and how much for the women's.
Yeah, God's overarching sovereignty is a huge theme in this book, and so it makes a lot of sense that would be something it would talk about. In the introduction to the book, I forget who wrote the introduction to this book, but he's talking about R.H. Charles' early work on it. He says, on the basis of evidence that he provided, it's clear that Paul and the authors of Luke, Acts, James, Hebrews, and 2 Peter were familiar with the expressions and ideas that appear in Jubilees.
Yeah. I think you're referring to the latest translation of Jubilees that's out is from the Hermania translation, which I would recommend if you want to get the Book of Jubilees, get that. It's one of the latest translations by James Vanderkam. He's done a lot of work on Jubilees. I've read a few articles by him as well, and he writes a great introduction to it, as well as a good commentary. I was reading through some of the commentary. It was actually pretty interesting and helpful. So I'd recommend that, James Vanderkam.
I was actually reading from O.S. Wintermute. He's the guy who does the introduction in Charlesworth's
I see.
pseudepigrapha volumes.
Okay. And Brian, this character Mastema, whose name appears in your Chronicles of the Nephilim, is plays a major role in Jubilee, and is saying to let's see. After the third week, the began to lead astray the children of the sons of Noah to make the air. God is praying to protect son from the demons, and the chief of the spirits, Mastema, said, "Lord, Creator, Son man before me." In other words, don't destroy all these demons, the spirits of these giants. Let them hearken to my voice and do all that I shall say to them. For if some of them are not left to me, I shall not be able to execute the power of my will on the sons of men. For these are for corruption and leading astray before my judgment, for great is the wickedness of the sons of men. And interesting that this is how Jubilees explains the presence of evil and wickedness on the earth. In First Enoch, it's the corrupt by the sons of God, Genesis 6, the Genesis 6 account. Mastema here is credited with saying, okay, let me have some of these demons so I can continue to tempt humanity, whereas in Enoch, it's like the demons were just condemned to wander the earth until the judgment, tormenting humanity. And again, it's possible that the author of Jubilees didn't want to even leave a hint that people might blame God for, why did God destroy the demons so we wouldn't be in this mess?
Yeah. But, I also think, though, you can really see the influence of Job on here, because that's not the only place where Mastema also suggests something to God. Also, when Abraham, it depicts Mastema as being the one that suggests to God the whole testing of Abraham incident, right? So it's almost like they drew from that Job, the passage that they know familiar with in Job with Satan, and are providing more instances where he does that,
And notice that it's actually in Jubilees that it tells us that 1/10 of the demons are allowed to remain, and the 9/10 are destroyed. So the 9/10 of the demons in the flood are gone, but 1/10 remains. And what's a tenth? Well, that's the
Tithe.
number for a tithe, isn't it? And so that kind of gets at this idea that it's more priestly language. It's almost like God is giving Mastema a tithe of evil creatures to do his will on the earth. It's a really wild idea.
It's a good catch. I hadn't even thought about that. The one of the other things I really caught, a couple of things and this is just because Sharon and I have done so much digging into the Amorites and their practices for the books we've written in Jubilees 14, which echoes Genesis 15 and 16, where Abraham, who at this time is still Avram, is telling God, "I'm childless, and how are you going to, make these promises come true? Because I don't have any children." In verse 2, and he said, "Lord, Lord, what wilt thou give me, seeing as I go childless? And the son of Mesech, the son of my handmaid, is the Damasek Eleazar. He will be my heir." Now, in our English Bibles, it says Eleazar of Damascus. And this jumped out at me because I've read about this in a paper by Nicholas Wyatt, who is a scholar who's done a lot on the Amorites and the Canaanites and so forth. He argues that verse in Genesis is actually a scribal gloss. In other words, a scribe trying to fix a text, and by this he means the Masoretic text, which was completed about 1,000 years after the Book of Jubilees was written. The expression "hu Damasek," which means of Damascus, is a scribal gloss explaining what was felt to be a damaged text, since the meaning of Meshech was lost until the Ugaritic texts were found. Those are the texts found in Syria around 1928, if I remember right, and helped shed some light on some of the more obscure parts of Hebrew. What it means is the son of Meshech, or Meshech, means the son of the cup, because it was the responsibility in the Amorite culture of the oldest son to once a month on the night of no moon summon the ancestors by name, and then feed the ancestors, and then pour out a drink offering. Well, as we continue to struggle against these technical issues, I think we may have said, made the point that we were trying to make, that this was Jubilees, overall an emphasis on the law and the keeping of the Jubilee, the 49-year cycle. Interesting that this was going on at the same time the Essenes were arguing for the keeping of the Jubilees. Ken Johnson and Josh Peck have done good work on that research, but approaching it from a different perspective. The priests must keep the law faithfully in order to purify and justify the world, whereas the Essenes were of the opinion that there was nothing except divine intervention of God that would basically solve the problem of evil in this world, and that. I think makes both of them worthwhile. I mean, again, Brian, we'll go around to the table one last time here, and hopefully we can do it before it kicks me off again. What's the big takeaway of Jubilees for you?
I think it's just sort of it's sort of a general. If you want to understand the Bible more from the ancient Jewish worldview through their eyes, this is one of the ways to at least get closer to that. It's not saying it's the only interpretation of the Bible or the correct one, because ancient Jews could be wrong too, right? But there's a lot of, when you read these books, there's a lot of tidbits or what would you call them, little snacks that you find, you discover, like we've talking about tonight, just little, oh, that's an interesting verse. And it helps shed light on some things that you already know about the Bible. And I don't mean the fictional elements or, the names of the wives or things that you won't know because the Bible just doesn't say anything. But in terms of just understanding that ancient mindset and how the ancient Jews interpreted the scriptures themselves is part of the fullness of our education as Christians in seeking to understand what was that ancient context of the Bible, because we're so saturated in our modern Western version and our Christians with their Christian living books, drawing from the Bible as a self-help thing, that it just helps us. It helps you to in your pursuit to get closer to that mindset, and it's it's always some interesting other things that you learn. Like I said, it may not be scriptural, it may not be true, but just fascinating to see how they thought about the world in those days.
Doug, what was the big thing you took
I'll just
away?
piggyback off of that. Yeah, just piggyback off of that. I think, to me, Jubilees is probably one of the top 5 pseudepigrapha that I think people should read, mainly because it's talking about Genesis and Exodus. And so we have other things that are out there. You could go read Genesis Rabbah, kind of later rabbinic commentaries and stuff like that. And there are, you can read Legends of the Jews and stuff like that. But this is like Genesis Exodus commentary.
Yeah.
Picking up a commentary and seeing what a person in the 1st century BC would have written as a commentary to Genesis. And I find that utterly fascinating and very informative and very important in helping us, especially when we come to New Testament and trying to understand, because this is as close to their world in the New Testament as you're going to get in terms of interpreting the biblical text. And it hasn't been tainted by post-Christian rabbinical hatred for Jesus, although it maybe there's some redactions and stuff that could have been. I was talking with Brian a minute ago, Derek, that there's an interesting little section in the end of chapter 44 that talks about the 70 nations. And we've talked about this a lot, right, with the divine council stuff. But it says, it's talking about all the persons of Jacob who entered Egypt were 70 persons. And therefore all the sons and grandsons of his 70, but 5 died in Egypt before Joseph, and they had no children. And 2 sons of Judah, Er and Onan, died in the land of Canaan, and they had no children. And the children of Israel buried those who perished, and they were set among the 70 nations. And I find this so fascinating because this is one of those passages that in the late part of Genesis and first chapter of Exodus, you find 70 people went down into Egypt. Mm-hmm. However, the Septuagint says 75 people went down into Egypt. And so it's there's this huge textual problem that you find that all the earliest manuscripts actually say 75, including Stephen in Acts 7. And here you have this one middle way thing where it's it was 70, but we acknowledge that 5 of them died, so we're not going to count those 5. And it's what is going on here? And, I've written a paper on this because I find that this was the change from 75 to 70 became the justification the rabbis used to change the number of the sons of God in Deuteronomy 32:8 to the number of the sons of Israel, because they knew the number was 70, but the number was actually 75. And so here you have this kind of explanation for how it could be 70, and that's how they finagle their little change in there in order to desupernaturalize the text. So, and those are the kinds of gems that you find, reading these books that if you didn't read them, you'd never even know that they're there.
And of course, 70
gems, that was the word.
Yeah.
Gems, yeah.
70 being the number that represents all the Gentile nations, so everyone but Israel. And the final line of, verse 5 of Jubilees 50, I think, The Jubilees shall pass by until Israel is cleansed from all guilt of fornication and uncleanness and pollution, and sin and error, and dwells with confidence in all the land. And there shall be no more a Satan or any evil one, and the land shall be clean from that time forevermore. That was the belief of the rabbis and the priests who were performing temple service. We keep doing this, and eventually the land will be cleansed and everything will be fine. And that was the fundamental conflict between them and the Essenes. And again, that's that viewpoint more represented by the book of First Enoch. So, and then later, I think by Christians, as we were taught that forgiveness, repentance, and forgiveness, and accepting Jesus Christ as Lord. That's how evil will eventually be cleansed from the land, but only then when He returns in the clouds with great glory. Fascinating to get a window of insight into what was, as you say, the Jewish world of the apostles in the first century A.D., because this just predated them by less than 2 centuries. Brian Godawa, and you'll find him online, Godawa.com. Doug Van Dorn, DouglasVanDorn.com. Judd Burton, we hope, back with us next time. We'll do the troubleshooting in between now and then. Guys, thanks for putting up with the technical issues this time. We'll hopefully get those sorted before we do this again. Check the notes below this podcast, whether you're watching or listening, and you'll get the links for the websites to Brian Godawa, Doug Van Dorn, and Dr. not appearing in this episode, Judd Burton. It was a mess trying to just the connection issues Judd had, and I had to. It is too much. I will sum up. Editing this one was a challenge. Not the kind of thing I have the time to do every single month, quite frankly. And we will be taking next month off. Not for that reason. I will explain why and share some thoughts about the firing of late night host Jimmy Kimmel as A View from the Bunker continues.
Chronicles of the Watchers is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history, a war of gods and men. Jezebel, harlot queen of Israel, Moses against the gods of Egypt, and other supernatural historical novels in the series Chronicles of the Watchers. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
There were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that. It was a time of gods and dragons.
This was supernatural war between Jesus, God, and the old gods.
We live in the final stage of a war that began before God said, "Let there be light."
The gods of ancient Sumer.
These giants are all through the Bible.
The things that are going on in the world right now, I'm sorry, but the writers, they're out.
Now, a fresh look at the end times that reveals the prophecy of the giants at Armageddon. Names the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse already loose in the world today.
These entities are real entities and not just metaphors or symbols.
And they're all named.
Unmasks the ancient dragons who walk the earth during the Great Tribulation.
A primordial entity such as Kronos or Chaos, Leviathan, Tiamat.
His breath kindles coals and a flame comes forth from his mouth. What is he describing here, if not a dragon?
And unveils hidden prophecies of their ultimate destruction. Giants, Gods, and Dragons by Sharon K. Gilbert and Derek P. Gilbert. From Defender Publishing.
Talking the walk from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. You'll find us online at vftb.net. On social media, at View from Bunker, at View from Bunker, or at Derek Gilbert, or at Gilbert House _TV. All of those will get you to our stuff. Also at PID Radio. We got a bunch of X accounts. part of our social media strategy to take over the world. On Facebook, please follow the View from the Bunker page. You'll find me also on Truth Social and Gab at Derek P. Gilbert, our YouTube address at Gilbert House. Please subscribe, share, click the bell for notifications, hit that like button, and leave your comments below the episodes. That does help us with the algorithms, and we appreciate all the algo help we can get. We also, once you do that, ask you to download our mobile app to your smartphone or tablet, which will guarantee we never get canceled, because the company that provides our app is a Christian company with no interest in censoring us. So, gilberthouse.org/app, or look for the link to the app at the vftb.net page. But gilberthouse.org/app, we've got mobile apps for iOS, Android, and what's the other? Amazon Fire tablets, phones and tablets. Links to all of those at gilberthouse.org/app. You can also get video versions for your TV or your smart TV or set-top box, Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, Google TV, Android TV, all the TVs. Just go to their app store, look for the Gilbert House Ministries app, add that to your smart TV or set-top box, and all of our video content will come right to you as well. We ask you to subscribe to our Telegram channel. I post a bunch of news items and things that I think are of interest there. That's t.me/view from the bunker, t.me/view from the bunker. And our Substack, please subscribe to our Substack, gilberthouse.substack.com. That's where we post everything, and including our audio content, links to our video content, and free excerpts from our books. So right now we're going through Giants, Gods, and Dragons. We've already posted everything from Bad Moon Rising, Second Coming of Saturn, the portions that I wrote from the new book, Destination Earth, about the UFO phenomenon. All that's available for free at our Substack account. So you can go back and read through the archives. None of it's behind a paywall. We appreciate your support, especially this year with the growing medical expenses. The Lord provides, and often through you, and we do appreciate that. That is very much appreciated. But again, all the content, gilberthouse.substack.com, is absolutely free to read and consume, and we appreciate your subscription there. Jimmy Kimmel was relieved of duties, or at least placed on indefinite suspension until, I guess that's what indefinite means, until further notice, because he made a really, really crass remark on Monday. In fact, it wasn't crass, it was just a flat-out lie regarding the alleged shooter of Charlie Kirk. Now, this was less than a week after Charlie had been killed, and his video, his murder, practically live-streamed. It was just horrific. If you've not seen the video, I encourage you not to look for it, because it's really... Some of the video that's been posted is really graphic. It is awful what has happened. But what the enemy meant for evil, the Lord is using for good. Turning Point USA, which had about 10,000 chapters, mostly on college campuses around the country, about 1,000 of them at high schools. Since that awful day, September 10th, last report I saw was that there have been more than 30,000 inquiries now. 30,000 inquiries about starting the Turning Point USA chapters. Erica Kirk has been now voted by the board of directors the new CEO of Turning Point USA. She was a successful businesswoman in her own right before she and Charlie met and began to date. So she's got the intellect and now the fire to continue this mission. And as she said, the mission, as Charlie always put it, is to make heaven crowded. And we pray that the Lord protects her and protects the mission from those who would try to push it into mission creep. Anyway, Jimmy Kimmel, contrary to what had been disclosed, the evidence that had been revealed by Governor Cox of Utah, the FBI, Tyler Robinson, the alleged shooter, was, by all accounts, a left-wing activist with connections, according to the FBI, with a radical group based out of Salt Lake City called Armed Queers SLC. And yet Jimmy Kimmel on his program Monday night said that Robinson was MAGA, Make America Great Again, a Trump supporter, and that conservatives were trying to twist things to blame liberals for something that a conservative had done. Well, some of the ABC affiliates that carry Kimmel's program took issue with that and said, we are going to preempt Kimmel's program for the foreseeable future. Some of these are stations that had dozens or hundreds of stations across the country, like Sinclair Broadcasting and Nexstar. So ABC took notice and informed Kimmel on Wednesday that he is suspended until further notice. That is probably a polite way of saying you're fired. The fact is that Kimmel, like Stephen Colbert on CBS and Jimmy Fallon on NBC, are tanking in the ratings. They have been for years because they stopped being funny when they decided that they needed to go all in as mouthpieces for the Washington establishment. And the fact is that they were getting really heavy-handed, ham-fisted in their approach to what is supposed to be comedy. Johnny Carson back in the day, David Letterman, Jay Leno, they would poke fun at politicians, but they do it on both sides and fairly gently. That was not the case with this new generation of late-night talk show hosts that catered to a small slice of the increasingly shrill, strident, and acerbic left. And they just shed audience. That's why Greg Gutfeld on Fox News, the Fox News channel, is actually winning in the late-night ratings. Surprise. So suddenly, the interesting thing about all this is that suddenly people on the left have discovered the First Amendment. They kind of did with Stephen Colbert as well, but they didn't care when people like Roseanne Barr and Tim Allen and Gina Carano and Tucker Carlson were being relieved of duty, losing their jobs, canceled. That was perfectly fine because they weren't towing the establishment line. But now you get Stephen Colbert, whose show was losing reportedly $40 million a year. Suddenly CBS is expected to have a constitutional imperative to keep dumping money into an incinerator for a show that fewer and fewer people were watching. Why? They're a business. They're trying to make money, not just burn it so that people on the left can feel, like they still have a voice. And the fact is, Jimmy Kimmel's suspension may be as much due to his ratings than what he said on Monday night. Apparently, Kimmel was going to go in and try to explain himself on his Wednesday program. He wasn't going to apologize because reportedly he said he didn't feel he had anything to apologize for. Well, okay. But, people on the left are saying this is President Trump's fault, just as it was with Colbert. Trump is running roughshod of the First Amendment. No, look, Colbert and Kimmel have the right to say whatever they want to say, but their employers don't have to tolerate it or accept it. Just like, if you got a barista at a coffee shop who decides that they won't serve somebody who's wearing a MAGA hat, the boss can say, okay, you can go sell coffee somewhere else. That's just the way of it. Just as the people who were publicly celebrating on social media the untimely death of Charlie Kirk, many of them have been relieved of their employment responsibilities. They're been told to go elsewhere. It's not an infringement of their free speech rights. They're free to speak and say whatever they like here in the United States. Again, their employer doesn't have to put up with it. Now, if the government, whether it's the White House or the FCC, and by the way, this isn't like when Barack and Michelle Obama personally called ABC to get Roseanne Barr, relieved from her show. She was killed off and they tried to continue the show that she created without her. But if the White House or the FCC gets involved and starts telling networks, you'd better take that person off the air because we don't like what they said, that's wrong. Because although conservative Christians may appreciate the fact that ABC has stepped in and said, Jimmy, that was over the line. you are now on vacation until we tell you otherwise. Won't always be a friendly government in the White House or running the FCC. Government bureaucrats should not have the power to adjudicate what is allowable speech on our broadcast networks or on our streets or on the internet. Some of the things that these people said about Charlie Kirk after his death were absolutely vile. But here in the United States, the First Amendment to the Constitution allows people, protects people, guarantees their right to be vile, despicable human beings. That doesn't mean their employers have to keep them on. Anyway, Jimmy, hope you find another job where you can actually go back to being funny. Next month, we are taking a month off in this program, and that is because October is going to be really busy. I'm under the gun to get a manuscript turned in for my next book, War of the Watchers, and I foolishly promised it October 31st, forgetting that we're leaving for Israel on October 19th, which means I'd better have the book done by October 15th so that we can get packed up and ready to get out of the country on the 19th. We're actually leaving a couple of days early and getting there ahead. With age comes the need for more rest. And so we're getting out there a day ahead so we can try to get caught up on the jet lag, the 7-hour time difference or 8-hour time difference now between the U.S. and Israel. So between that and other things in October, we got a couple of other things going on. We are going to take a month off from Iron and Myth, and we will be back in November with another program. The next one we will deal with the Book of Jasher, actually. Should be very interesting. So that'll also give us time to read the Book of Jasher and compare it to Jubilees and 1st Enoch. And I think that should make for a fascinating discussion. Hopefully also enough time to troubleshoot the technical issues and get those resolved. We got a couple of conferences coming up in 2026 already. The Go Therefore conference is back on the last weekend in July. And Sharon and I told Dr. Mike Spalding that we would be honored to once again be part of that company. And just keep an eye at gothereforeconference.com for more information as we get closer to those dates. Of course, we'll have details on the other speakers and streaming video and other things like that. But it's always been a great gathering, and we would love to see more people at next year's gathering there in Brookville, Ohio, just outside Dayton. Also, the Remnant Rising Conference, the Hear the Watchman Ministries put on here in Springfield, Missouri, was a wonderful gathering, and we are looking forward to doing it again next year. It will again be in August in Springfield at the same facility, the Oasis Hotel and Convention Center. Wonderful facility. So we will have more information on that, of course. But Hear the Watchman has already confirmed that that is a thing, and Sharon and I have accepted the invitation to return. So those are the two that we've already got on the books for next year. And of course, we appreciate whenever we can speak at a conference that's just driving distance. Again, the older we get, the more difficult travel becomes. So again, just keep an eye at our website or at hearthewatchmen.com for more information as it becomes available. We're getting close to the Israel tour, less than a month away now, so still a couple of seats left on the bus if you'd like to join us, but you'd best already have your passport if you would like to go. We're going to some very interesting spots this time that we've not been before. We will visit Samaria, and I'm talking about the region, I'm talking about the ancient city, the capital of Ahab and Jezebel, where Jezebel met her demise and the dogs dragged her away after she was pushed out of the tower. That should be really interesting. We will also go to the Shamir Dolman field and show people that dolman with the 50-ton capstone. That's the one that goes across the top. 50 tons. How did they get that up into place? 100,000 pounds. I'm not quite. Yeah, I haven't figured out the physics of that. I'm sure there's engineers who figured that out, but I'm not. My math doesn't math that hard. Anyway, That and a lot more. We've got the itinerary actually for the tour posted at gilberthouse.org/travel, along with dates for next year's tour. And so if you're interested, we will be going back to Israel next October, and we would love for you to join us. Love to show you why we get so excited about returning to these key battleground sites in this long supernatural war, which frankly is what my next book is about, the War of the Watchers. Why is Israel so important, and why is there so much hostility, anger, bloodshed connected to that land? That's not the human actors. It's principalities, powers, cosmic rulers over this present darkness. You find more as information becomes available at gilberthouse.org/travel. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen, as the case may be. If you're subscribing to the podcast, whether it's at Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, wherever fine podcasts are sold, please give us a good review if you got a spare moment, and give us a like at the Facebook page. Our announcer, the inimitable DC Good, and A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Good night, Oliver, wherever you are. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is A View from the Bunker.